Well, hello and welcome, or welcome back to InsurTech Talk. Our goal with this short, content-rich format is to provide actionable insights that will help independent insurance agents navigate and optimize their knowledge and use of insurance technology. Each month, we feature a specific topic based on current events and questions that we get from our listeners. George Robertson and I are very excited to be back with you. Our hope is that you're staying well and finding ways to support each other and your clients during these very challenging times. George, welcome.
Thank you, Kitty. And yes, Kitty, these are challenging times, and we want to wish all of our listeners safety and the very best for their clients. And over the past several months, we put together a number of topics for the industry. If you're new with us and would like to catch up on prior episodes, you can visit www.avis.com/blog.
Well, I think today's episode is no exception to our purpose of bringing actionable insights to insurance agents. With all the challenges we've been experiencing around COVID-19 and the pandemic, so many more agencies are being faced with issues surrounding cybersecurity for themselves and for their clients. So we are extremely excited to have with us today a very special guest who is going to address some common misconceptions surrounding cybersecurity.
That's right. New regulations and concerns seem to be popping up daily, and this is certainly creates a lot of confusion for insurance agency owners. In addition, it's a fantastic competitive advantage for agents who are actively promoting cyber coverages to their clients to understand key terms and compliance regulations.
It is my pleasure to introduce our guest today, Mr. Dustin Mooney. Dustin is a co-founder and principal consultant at RigidBits. He leads the security program development, incident response, and computer forensics practices. His cybersecurity experience is founded in performing security audits and assessments for government agencies, and he has some great stories to tell. Building on his background, Dustin also conducts technical testing utilizing both offensive and defensive security techniques. He specializes in computer and digital forensic and leans on his cybersecurity background to bring a unique approach to investigations.
Yes, and as a forensic analysis, Dustin has experience testifying in court and analyzing evidence for litigation scenarios. His 8 years conducting forensic investigations has honed his skills in quickly learning new environments, identifying potential areas of risk, and discovering breaches and vulnerabilities. Dustin is a graduate of George Mason University with a BS in Applied Information Technology and focus on network security. He received his post-baccalaureate certificate in computer and digital forensics from the University of Rhode Island.
Dustin, we're super excited to have you with us today, and I know you're going to touch on some misconceptions surrounding cybersecurity, things like terms, where we are with laws and compliance, and then we'll share some techniques that can make a big difference for agents in this environment. So without further ado, Dustin, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, George. Thank you, Kitty. I'm so happy to be here today. Would love to be with you in person, but here we are. So thank you so much. We are going to talk about some misconceptions, and sprinkled in there, you're going to see some of these items that we're hitting on the bullet points. There's going to be some very key cybersecurity terms that everybody should be aware about. We're going to talk about laws and regulations and maybe some misconceptions around those. And then finally, how to implement cybersecurity and some things I think that I see, as dealing with my clients, that things that individuals miss and things that they really need to hone their focus on. So we'll cover those. I'm here with RigidBits. We are a cybersecurity company. We specialize in helping our clients identify their cybersecurity risks. And then what we do is we help provide consultative services to reduce those risks to an acceptable level. So with that, I'm ready to get going so we can dive into this first misconception here.
All right, terrific.
Awesome. And so we're going to talk about cybersecurity decision making. I think there's something that goes hand in hand in this with this, and that's, where do I start with cybersecurity? Well, I would argue that you want to start with how you make decisions about cybersecurity. So to do this, we really need to go into some key terms and some very key concepts that we want to cover and really start with. And before we do that, I just want to say this quote that I've kind of been putting out there that I think is really valuable. So this is one of my own, so I'm really proud of it. It's basically, there is no secure. There is only more or less risk. So if you're talking to a vendor, somebody selling you a product, and they're telling you how secure it is, it's a little bit binary of a concept to think about. It's either secure or it's not. In reality, when we think about cybersecurity, we look at it in terms of risk, and risk is really a sliding scale, right? Some things are more risky, some things are less risky, okay? So we really want to use that thought process moving forward. So Kitty, if you want to go ahead, I'll talk about risk a little bit deeper.
Terrific.
And before I get into this, I love talking to insurance professionals because, you guys are selling the same thing that I am as a cybersecurity professional. You're selling risk aversion. I'm just doing it from a cybersecurity standpoint. So I think a lot of these terms will translate over pretty easily and quickly. So the concept of risk, really what we have here are two variables that we need to understand that'll show us how something can be more or less risky. And as I stated earlier, with risk being on a sliding scale, we have likelihood over here on the left side of the formula and then impact over on the right. Both of these things are also on a sliding scale as well. So we need to figure out how likely something is to happen to us. And we also need to figure out how impactful that will be to our business. So let me break that down a little bit further. Let's start over on the left side here for likelihood. Now, for likelihood, one of the most influencing variables is going to be the presence of vulnerabilities, right? So vulnerability being a weakness in a system, in a process, in a piece of technology, software, a platform, a cloud system, right? So anything that you're using, so vulnerability is a weakness. And for vulnerabilities, there really are these different influencing factors that can make something more or less vulnerable, right, or severe in vulnerability. So one of those being, how many people know that this vulnerability exists in my environment? The next one being, how easy is it for me to find that this vulnerability is there as a hacker? Another one being, can I exploit it, right? Can I take advantage of that vulnerability to take control over that computer system to have it do what I want? And then the final one being, is my company or am I able to stop that exploit, right? So if you look at the concept of vulnerability with all of those four things that I just mentioned, we can quickly understand how something could be more severe. So if there's a large group of people, hackers, that know I have this vulnerability, I've got more people coming at me. If it's easy for them to find, then they're spending less time and it makes me a little bit more of a prime target. If there is a publicly available exploit as a hacker that I can go grab and launch against you, that's really easy. It doesn't take a lot of time, not a lot of investment to make that happen. So again, it's going to increase the severity. And then finally, as the company, if I haven't done anything to stop this attack or I haven't implemented some cybersecurity best practices, that could increase the severity of the vulnerability as well. So that'd be an example of something that's very high severity. So you can quickly see how that would increase the likelihood of a potential attack happening to you, a successful attack.
So if
now, on the other side, we have...
I was just going to ask a little bit in terms of identifying those vulnerabilities. Is it some software that, I know you're going to get into this, but is it some software that does that? Is there people skills involved? Or you want to just say, hey, I'm going to get to this later, Kitty?
A little bit of it. No, that's great. A little bit of everything, actually. So let's say I'm doing a vulnerability scan of a network, right? Yeah, I'm going to use some software to find where those software vulnerabilities are, but they can be in your software, they can be in networking devices, they can be in your computers, in your servers, right? And so these vulnerabilities sitting there are the things that hackers are looking for. Now, you could also have a vulnerability in a person. If that individual hasn't gone through security awareness training or they're failing phishing tests, and they're clicking on everything, that vulnerability is inherent to that person. So these things can show up all over the place. There really is many opportunities for vulnerabilities to be there. So hackers are aware of these things. They know that they are in software. They know that they're in people, as well as many other things, even processes too. Those are things that we want to consider.
And Dustin, one more thing there is we're looking at operating systems. If they've got an older operating system, that could be an issue as well as updates.
Right. And quite frankly, exactly what George said there, if you have vulnerabilities in software and networking devices and servers, typically it's because of a lack of updates. These are known vulnerabilities. There's also a whole list of what we call kind of unknown vulnerabilities. Hackers will find these and kind of keep them in their back pocket. So just because you don't think you have a vulnerability doesn't mean that you don't. But those are really unique cases, and let's just say the risk on those is a little bit lower. If you go back to those 4 things I mentioned, right? If a hacker, only one person has it, it's a little bit less of an opportunity for you to get attacked. So that's how we can always go back to that kind of those 4 concepts.
Great.
Awesome. All right, so I will jump over to impact over here on the right side. So the same way that likelihood has the sliding scale, same thing with impact. And the way that we think about impact is we use this term called CIA, the CIA of cybersecurity. Those 3 words being confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So the concept of confidentiality being, can I keep the information secret that I want to remain secret? If you're communicating over email with your CEO about sensitive company information, that's the kind of thing you don't want everybody knowing about, right? So it's great to have some cybersecurity protections on your email systems to maintain your confidentiality. Now, on the other side, we have integrity over here. I trust that the data that I'm looking at, that I'm processing, that I'm expecting to see hasn't been changed. Is it what I expect it to be? And so one great example of this would be if there's a hacker in your email system, there's a common attack where they'll wait for some sort of financial transaction to occur, and then they'll jump in the middle and say, well, actually, the routing numbers and the accounting numbers for the transaction are this. And so that person on the receiving end of that new email thinks that they're sending, that money to the right place, when in reality, you have an integrity problem because you can't really trust that the information flowing over your email system is what the people receiving it expect it to be. So this is an example of integrity. And then the last one being availability. Can I get to the data? Can I get to the systems that I need to do my job? Going along with that email compromise kind of concept, if the hacker decided to turn off, change your password, and then turn on multi-factor authentication, you may not be able to get into your email, and you might have this couple hour delay where you're waiting on your IT representative to maybe reset your password or whatever it may be, right? So this would be a compromise of availability. And one key thing I do want to mention about this concept of impact is that ultimately what we want to get to is, what is the impact to our business? But that's kind of the last step. There's something before that we really need to think about. And when we think about these CIA terms, we think of them in terms of CIA to the data and the systems processing that data. We need to consider that before we can really extrapolate how that's going to impact the business. And then finally, really what we're trying to do here is this kind of, 4th bullet point of, identify what our cybersecurity risks are, and then implement cybersecurity best practices so that we can mitigate and reduce our risk exposure. One small comment about risk is that risk will always be there. There is this, the cost of doing business using technology to help us become more efficient, process more clients, things like this. There's a cost, and that's risk. So if anybody ever comes to you and tells you that they can eliminate your risk or we can remove it completely, this is really a bit misleading, because there will always be risks associated with using technology. The final thing is, once we've implemented, accept the risk of using these pieces of software, these systems, and we can say, you know what, I understand that these risks are here, but I've done all of these protections and put all these things in place, so I'm just going to go ahead and use this system as it is. So that's a completely acceptable thing to do.
Yeah, when I think about risk, I always think about it's not so much a matter of if, it's the matter of when and what am I going to do then, So I think your 5th bullet point is going to talk to us about how we should be aware and reporting when we notice things that might be awry. So
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And this last bullet here is really kind of the bullet of misconception. And so because we understand how we need to approach cybersecurity and how we need to think about it based off of risk, what are some reasons why maybe we might miss that, or maybe why we might not do that? From my perspective as a cybersecurity consultant, first one being management buy-in. You've really got to have your management on board who understands that there are cybersecurity risks and that they're willing to do something about it. Now, management may use different approaches to addressing cybersecurity risks. They may go buy every piece of cybersecurity software and install it, but this is not really the way that we approach it, right? We need to understand which systems and applications are most risky, and then find cybersecurity best practices that we can use to bring that risk down to an acceptable level. So management needs to understand that, and they need to buy into that. Now, one of the reasons I see them not doing this are these two terms that are after this: optimism bias and identity restriction. So optimism bias being the concept of, despite a statistical likelihood of some negative event happening to you, you believe that it won't. And then this kind of goes together with identity restrictions. I see a lot of this when I interact with small and medium-sized businesses. And, I talk to decision makers, and they say to me, well, I'm small. Hackers not coming after me. I don't have that much to give away, right? So they're not going to go after me. And quite frankly, it's quite just a fallacy, because it's quite the opposite of the truth. Actually, you are the target. You're the prime target. And the reason being is because hackers know that small and medium-sized businesses tend to not allocate as many resources as big companies do, and they know that they're a little bit easier to hack, a little bit quicker targets to go after. Hackers tend to take the path of least resistance. They can be inherently lazy, and if there's an easier target versus a harder target, they're going to go after that easier target. So that small and medium-sized business, the concept of I'm not a target, it's just, unfortunately, it's just not true. So that's a big misconception about this.
what an eye-opening thing too for our insurance agents who, statistically write an awful lot of small and medium-sized businesses who may have that sort of misconception that they're not a target, so therefore they don't need cyber liability. So what an important, concept here from that whole cybersecurity 101 piece for agents to understand that their clients fall into.
And if I could just mention one more thing, and George, if you want to chime into this one, feel free to. But I like to ask people, where does cyber formula? Is it on the likelihood side, or is it on the impact side?
That's a great question, and I tell you, it's a little bit of both, in my opinion, because you've got the chances of you being hacked are very high. I think that's the stats I saw the other day were 60% of businesses within a 5-year period are going to be hacked. And then on the impact of that could be huge, especially if it's ransomware and it's locked all your machines down, which I've seen in several occasions with agencies today. And they have to go replace all the machines and put all the software back on the machines. And it's impactful not just from a cost perspective of the machines, but the downtime.
Yeah, that's a great answer. From my perspective, I think that cyber liability insurance falls a little bit more on the impact side. And the reason why I say that is because it's basically a shift in financial liability. Like once you have this incident happen, somebody's going to pay for some of those issues, right? But from a perspective, how likely is something more or less likely to happen to you if you have cyber liability insurance? Now, it may reduce that likelihood side of the formula, but when you interact with companies like George's company, with my company, we're a little bit more on this likelihood side. We're finding ways to bring down the fact that an attack could happen to you, right? And we do that by implementing cybersecurity best practices. All right, I think I'm ready for misconception 2, Kitty.
Okie doke, here we go.
From a perspective of, do I have to do something about cybersecurity? I see a lot of misconceptions about this, and not just misconception, but maybe misunderstanding or even lack of knowledge of what to do. So that's kind of what this section is going to be. So compliance. There's some specific things that we can call out very quickly to dispel that myth of, well, maybe I don't have anything to abide by, right? Well, if you live in the United States of America or one of its territories, you are already subject to a breach notification law, whether you like it or not. All 50 states plus the territories. Now, the small, I guess, caveat with this is some states enforce this a little bit more than others, some not at all. So you could have a breach, you could leak a bunch of data and nobody may ever know about it, and you could get away with that. So, but at the end of the day, if your business is, doing your due diligence and you're doing your due care, part of that is going to be identifying which laws you do need to abide by. So you're going to find something. So breach notification. You've also got data security laws and data disposal laws. Now, these are not quite as vast, but they're still pretty high up there. I think data security is around 36 territories, and then data disposal is a little lower, maybe around 32 or so. And these things are fluid. They're always changing. Some laws are becoming more advanced in terms of what they're requiring. Some laws are new, right? So there's this constant shift in how these things are interacting and operating. So you really got to keep an eye on these specific laws. And so at this point, you already have a law, but there's more to come on top of that. So let's talk about the New York Compliance Law 23 NYC RR 500. I bet a lot of people on the line are very familiar with this and are very intimate with it. I know George is. So this law, HIPAA, NAIC, and more, right? So these are these regulatory bodies that are kind of sitting over top of us that may be telling us, hey, you're part of my organization. You need to do something about cybersecurity. Anything to add on that, George?
Yeah, I'll add this. Is very interesting, Dustin. In some research that I did over the past year, I found out that North Carolina actually requires a written information security plan for every agency within the state. And then, of course, South Carolina and other states have implemented the NAIC model law, which requires written information security plans. So
right.
Agencies as a whole, really, in my opinion, I think you would agree, should have a written plan and do their analysis. And I'm sure you'll talk a little bit more about that as well.
You're hitting misconception 3. I like it. You're ahead of me, but good stuff. So just to expand on this a little bit, so there are these laws, right? And the interesting thing about this that I'm seeing is that this 23 NYC RR 500 law, the next bullet below it, frameworks, very similar things, right? So what a framework is this is a guide. It's a cybersecurity guide. There are very smart people who have done a lot of the hard work for us, and what they've done is they've gone and listed, hey, if you're going to do some things about cybersecurity, these are the topics that you want to consider. So here's very specific topic 1, topic 2. There's a ton of them. There's really a lot of these things, and the topics, we call them cybersecurity controls. Okay, so that's the vernacular, if you will, about what that is. So 23 NYC RR 500. There are a very specific list of things that you need to accomplish. Now, the key point I want to make from this is that if you do have NAIC requirements, state law requirements, HIPAA requirements, well, maybe not HIPAA, let's leave that one out. But if there's some other laws that you need to abide by, a lot of these NAIC states or whoever else is requiring you to do things they use a concept called a high watermark. And they're using the 23 NYC RR 500 law as that high watermark. And what that means is if you do New York law compliance, you're probably going to be compliant with 95% of these other NAIC model law states. I think they're all kind of saying like, hey, you can do ours, but you can also do New York. And that really speaks to the overlap in a lot of this, right? So NYC RR is not terribly different from things that you're going to see in HIPAA or other frameworks or other model laws and things like that. So if you can hit that one, I would say strive for it. Use that as your starting point. And if there are some additional requirements that your state is requiring, you can address those separately. So it's a great place to start. And then go pick a framework too, right? This will give you some concepts and things that you want to think about as you protect cybersecurity in your firm and your organization. There are frameworks for cloud-based systems, for specific servers that you're using, for general cybersecurity. Lots of great information in these frameworks, so go ahead and search for those. A couple key things to look for would be the CIS 20. This is the Center for Internet Security, 20 cybersecurity controls. Other ones being with NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology. You can look up 853 as well as 800-171. Those are good starting points. A little little verbose for me. They're very wordy, but they will give you some things to think about. So go ahead and take a look at those. And then kind of just pulling out of this, like what's going to keep showing up in all of these frameworks and laws? No doubt about it. Security program development, writing policies and procedures. This is your written information security plan. Like George was mentioning a second ago, you're going to have to do a risk assessment. You're going to have to do an incident response plan and more. And then I just want to mention one thing about the risk assessment. For that New York law, when you do your risk assessment, it's going to say go do a risk assessment. But in some of the other controls, it's going to say do this based off of your risk assessment. So you're always going to be going to that. It's a key document. And, right? So how do we calculate risk? We got to find the likelihood times the impact to our systems, right? So this is a challenge. This is a pretty hefty task that if you don't have a lot of experience doing this, you might need some help. So consider going out and looking for people that can help you get on top of some of these services.
And Dustin, let me ask a quick question there from your perspective. How often should an agency review that plan?
Yeah, so rule of thumb, cybersecurity best practice is at least once a year. And a lot of these laws are going to say that too. Once a year, you need to go through and look at this. The small caveat to that being, if you have a major system change. So let's say you were working, let's say you had an infrastructure in your office that was, physical network in your office, and then you move to the cloud. And this is that time where you're going to have to go, you know what? Time to review everything again, because we have this whole new infrastructure that we need to consider. If you're adding new major systems, I would say maybe if you switched off one agency management platform to another, I'd say that'd be a good time to review your written information security plan as well. This happens a lot, so things that we want to think about.
Yeah, and another thing that comes to mind is, the onerous job of completing your cybersecurity application for insurance and all of the questions that are asked there and all of the data that in a lot of cases is being requested and the checkbox that says, yep, I'm in compliance with the law that governs my state or my
Yeah.
business. So, I think that there's a lot of checkpoints that really are impactful if we will address them at that time.
Yeah. And Kitty, if you don't mind me expanding on that thought a little bit, this
Yeah,
is something that's been a little fresh in my mind. I've gotten a chance to see some of these cyber liability requests. Hey, show me this, show me that, and quite frankly, they have some work to do. They're not always asking for the right things. Sometimes, there's really no verification either. Like, yes, I have this. Okay, great. Thanks for saying yes, but we don't really know, and we also don't know how good of a job whoever wrote that it has done. There may be some gaps and things like that. So from my perspective as a cybersecurity professional, I would love to see the cyber liability market really incorporate ways that their clients that are purchasing these plans and these protections, that they can also offer potential opportunities to reduce the likelihood of the attack happening, because at this point they're just giving them away to everybody. And so I use this analogy of I like to compare cybersecurity to cars just because it always seems to translate. So imagine just giving every driver the same policy and saying, okay, see you guys later. It's not really going to work. There's going to be some people that are driving more risky than others, some people that have accident histories, right? And so these things are kind of not even really being looked at. Whereas I think a closer eye could really reduce the cost of the premium, right? You could identify who your potential more risky clients are that you're going to be paying out these premiums to if they keep getting hacked. And then that's another thing too, is if you are buying cyber liability insurance and you're doing nothing to reduce the likelihood side of your risk, do you want to file 5 cyber insurance claims per year? It's probably going to look really bad and you might get denied eventually, right? So eventually you're going to have to get on top of that likelihood thing. You can't just rely on the fact that impact is reduced. You have to do some best practices.
Yeah, and you talk about likelihood and impact, and we talk about frequency and severity in the insurance world. So they definitely correlate for sure. And I couldn't agree more that being aware of what creates the risk in the first place certainly is the first step in mitigating some of those concerns. So terrific.
Awesome. So I'm ready for the next misconception. All right. So when you're going to actually address your cybersecurity issues and implement these best practices, right, what do you do? And I think this is, again, not quite maybe a misconception, maybe a little bit of a blend of a misunderstanding. So let's go ahead and dive into that. As we talked about earlier, we need management buy-in. And, I think the big point that I want to make out of this is that we really need to look at cybersecurity as a core business function now. So if you have an HR team and you have an accounting team and finance and whatever departments you have, well, now you also have cybersecurity department. That's how you really should be looking at it as it pertains to your agency, because these things are real and they're happening and the risk is there, right? So if we're going to look at it as a core business function, obviously we're going to need some sort of budget. Now, budget can come in the form of monetary value, but I'm also talking allocation of resources and time. George, you can speak to this a little bit more as well too, but as consulting firms, we come in and we help individuals, get on top of their cybersecurity challenges, but it takes some attention from that agency, right? There's going to be an individual that we need to work with, that we need to talk to, that needs to go find information for us and answer questions. And so this budgeting also includes the allocation of resources and people and individuals. So something to consider there.
Right, and Dustin, I would go even to the next level as I've gone in and talked to agents, just talking to staff, and you find out that the management team thinks staff is doing one thing in security, but when you get down to the real people who are taking the data every day, it's not as secure as they think. So really interviewing the staff and the other people involved and key players and doing the risk analysis is a key point to this.
Right. And then there's a question that I often ask myself, George, again, if you want to chime in here, is whose job is it, right? Because one of the misconceptions I see with this is, oh, well, my IT provider is handling that. And unfortunately, I guess some IT providers are telling their customers that they're doing that for them. And then when a company like mine or George comes in and looks, we go, well, you kind of missed this, you didn't do this, right? So whose job is it? Should IT be doing this for you, or do you need somebody with a specific focus in cybersecurity that understand these concepts to come in and supplement what your IT provider is doing? So something to consider there. And then after you've created this budget, after you've allocated resources, you really want to start by identifying what your risks are. And so there's a couple ways to do this. The primary one being to conduct a risk assessment. This is an exercise that takes some time. There's this information gathering portion and then this calculation of, okay, well, you answered all these questions this way, so your likelihood is this. And then you answered all these impact questions this way, so your impact is this. And then based off of that, you have a high risk or a medium risk or a low risk. And then some other options that you have is, I'm sure that when George is talking to a potential customer, he's doing a scoping call. Let's find out where you are. What do you have? What don't you have? So even just that conversation can really make some eyes light up and some light bulbs turn on. So do a scoping call, right? A lot of times those are free too. So it's free information. I encourage you to go get it. And then there's some other quick little services that you can do or things that you can find online. You'll look for a cybersecurity gap analysis, right? So this will be a list of questions, usually yes or no, do we have this, do we not have this? And you can start seeing where you're missing things. Now, I just want to make one error and caution here that a gap analysis is not a risk assessment. A gap analysis is a set of yes or no questions. A risk assessment is assessment of the likelihood of a negative cybersecurity event happening to you times the impact that would have on your company. So there's a little bit more that goes on in the risk assessment. Be cautious with companies that are telling you that their gap analysis are risk assessments. So just be cautious of that. And then as you go through these things, you're going to get to this point where you're like, wow, I have all these risks. There are things that I need to fix. So you're going to have to go pick a framework. Sometimes these frameworks can live in those laws that we talk about, or you can go directly and download one, and then you can go follow exactly what it's saying for you to do. Now, again, if you don't have a cybersecurity background, some of this is going to be challenging. Some of the terminology may be confusing. You might not know how to do something. You might have to interact with your IT provider. So there are some challenges with using frameworks. But if you're pretty smart and you think you can figure things out, go ahead and grab one and take a look at it. I'm sure, maybe you might not understand everything in there, but there's going to be some things that you can pull out. and some cybersecurity best practices that you can implement that'll automatically reduce your risk. I'll tell you one really easy one that you'll probably get: turn on multi-factor authentication, right? That's not that hard. And the amount of risk reduction that that does is astronomical. It's not a perfect solution, but it's really, really good. So that would be an example of something that you would see in a framework. And I just want to mention too, as you know, as a forensic analyst, whenever somebody comes to me and says, hey, you know, my business email got hacked, I ask them that question: do you have multi-factor authentication on? Although I already know the answer, and that is no, because if they did have it on, that probably wouldn't happen. So just something to consider there. And as you pick this framework and as you find which controls you're going to implement, part of that process is going to be writing policies and writing procedures. So let's say you went and you turned on multi-factor authentication. That's great. But let's say the individual that's responsible for doing that leaves the company, or for some reason they're unavailable, and somebody needs to come in and check, like, hey, how did we come to this conclusion? How do we determine to do this? Well, how you do that is writing policies and procedures. And those things are going to show up in your written information security program, as well as your discussion of risk, what your cyber liability insurance looks like, the controls you're going to implement, and then these specific policies and procedures. So I'll try to give an example of maybe what a policy or procedure might look like and how you should approach it. I think that'll help clear up some confusion. So we'll just run with that multi-factor authentication concept. So you need to word your policy as a statement of something that you're going to require yourself to do. So basically you would say something like, you know, my company is going to require all cloud-based applications to use multi-factor authentication. Okay, so that's your policy. Hey, we're going to require ourselves to do this. Your procedure is how you're actually going to do that. Our IT administrator will log into every cloud-based application we have, review the settings, check to make sure that multi-factor authentication is required, and where any gaps are identified, we'll document that, and then we'll turn it off for those systems. That's your procedure. That's the follow-through. Okay, so you've got to write these things down, and you've got to actually do them as well, and they really have to go together. If you write down policies and procedures and you don't do them, they're kind of useless. If you do things and you've implemented best practices, but you don't write it down, I think it's good you implemented it, but you're still missing a big step. And there could be some problems with not writing that down. Anything to add to that, George?
Oh, I definitely agree, Dustin. You've got to write these things down. You've got to notify staff as well of the procedures and make sure they understand. And just as simple as making a password policy. What is your password policy, and what should they be doing with passwords? Multi-factor authentication. You could get on and just incident response plans. There are different things in there, and then put the procedures in with who has to follow up on those, and maybe even an audit process for people to check to make sure it's getting done.
Perfect. Yeah, exactly. In your procedure, you should be saying who has to do this. What frequency do they have to do it at, right? Is it once a month? Is it once a year? This kind of thing. What are we going to do if we find that maybe something's not implemented, right? So you need to write that down. So there's this kind of discussion that you need to have kind of with yourself. You know, what am I going to do about this? That's a great question to ask yourself. And then finally, as you do these things, you're going to start finding, you know, hey, I need to keep track of this. Like, there's a lot to do here. And how do I know what I finished? How do I know what I'm missing? And so you want to use this concept that we call plan of action and milestones through your POAM. This is something that came out of federal auditing, you know, my experience back then. Some of these documents that they use can directly translate over to how we can protect ourselves as independent businesses and things like that. So go Google the word plan of action and milestones, get yourself a template, look at that thing, and then document basically the best practices that you choose that you're going to implement. And then as you do that, you can start checking it off. And the great thing about this is if you have some responsibility in IT that you have to do these things, it's a great document to do it. And then after you're, you know, as you've made some progress, you can take it to management and say, hey, look at all these great things that I've done for our company. And these things are reducing our risk as we speak. So it's good validation for everything that you're working on, as well as keeping track of the things that you want to get to eventually. And there may be some bigger picture items on the POAM. There may be some immediate things that you just need to turn on, like two-factor, right? And then as you build your plan of action, what you really want to do is tie that to your risk assessment, right? Because your risk assessment is going to tell you, hey, we have these deficiencies and these systems are the most important to us. So you can put those at the top of your plan of action and start with those, and you can start bringing that risk down to an acceptable level.
And that's one thing I'll add on that piece as well in that action plan is to put in maybe an estimated timeline of when you're going to complete this particular task.
Yeah, exactly.
Factor, or maybe it's encryption of the laptops as an example as to when they think they will get that completed.
And then if you're a decision maker and you're kind of looking at this plan of action and you see that you have these scheduled times of, hey, I want to finish by this time, and you start seeing that these things aren't getting done, as you wanted to, that may be a big clue that you need some help, right? So that could be a great opportunity to go, okay, let me go bring in another resource. Let me have somebody that can help speed these things up. So it's important to stay on top of it, right? Just having that document live doesn't really do anything for you. You need to go implement the things that are inside of that document. And I think that's going to be everything from my perspective. Hopefully that cleared up some misconceptions and misunderstandings.
That's great information. And I'll tell you just a couple of things there. Just making sure you got your operating systems are up to date. Looking at multi-factor password procedures. But the key, really, that risk assessment, Dustin, I think is crucial right out of the gate to understand really where you are to set the bar, and then putting the plans in place and the procedures, and then having that action plan towards the end. Great information for our listeners.
Yeah, that's terrific. And Dustin,
Awesome.
they can find you at rigidbits.com, I assume.
Correct. Yep. Mm-hmm. If you want a gap analysis or you want that scoping call, go ahead and reach out to info@RigidBits. Ryan Smith, our guy over there, will take care of you. We work on educating our clients. That's kind of how we kind of show what we're good at. And so Ryan will educate you. He'll sit there and talk with you like a normal human being. No sales, no pushy sales guys over here. So feel free to reach out. We'll be happy to chat with you.
That is terrific. Very helpful. So I do have one question that comes to mind as we think about the multi-factor authentication. One of the things that I hear often from agents is, I don't know how to do that because I don't really want it tied to an individual employee's cell phone that may or may not be company property. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a tough one. Because honestly, that's our source of multi-factor authentication is usually our cell phone. So maybe taking it back to a cybersecurity concept. So we talk about authentication with some different concepts. So what is your password, right? It can also be something that you have, something that you are. Those can be other things as well. So maybe you have a two-factor token, right? So you can go buy these keys that you plug into your computer, so you physically have something. That's your second way of authenticating. The other option being, well, maybe there's a fingerprint scanner or maybe an iris scanner, right? Something that you are. Those are other ways to authenticate who you are. So if you really don't want to use a cell phone, there are some other options, but you just need to kind of look at what you have and who you are. Those are the other options for you.
George, any final comments or questions that come to mind for you?
Well, I think this has been a great session, Kitty, and just wonderful information for our listeners. And we just want to thank Dustin for his time.
Yes, Dustin, thank you so much, and thank you for all of the insight and tips and actions that we can take and places we can go and even terms to Google. So that was all very, very helpful in terms of getting this done. So. Again, thanks a bunch for sharing your expertise with us.
You're welcome.
If you have additional questions or topics that you'd like George and I to touch on in the future, please feel free to reach out to us and either comment on an existing blog or simply shoot us an email. We are certainly always happy to help. InsurTech is brought to you by Avast. For insurance professionals seeking to eliminate inefficient workflows, Avast technology brings together all the players in the industry's ecosystem: agents, brokers, carriers, MGAs, wholesalers, and even other tech firms like RigidBits. The Avast team comprises entrepreneurs, insurance experts, and technology advocates who for years have campaigned to provide the experience for both the insurance professional and the consumer that is much more simple and navigable in this challenging industry we have. We envision a world where confident insurance professionals deliver an enjoyable customer experience without paper or error. You can certainly find out more about us by visiting avast.com. Also, a great big thank you to George Robertson of George Robertson Consulting. George is an extremely knowledgeable resource on insurance technology matters and can be reached directly at grobertson@georgerobertsonconsulting.com. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and stay safe out there.